The descent into frozen hell. The transport shuttle rattled violently as it plunged through the dense, violet-tinged clouds of Frost-9, a planet so inhospitable that even the most resilient species in the galaxy feared it. Below, a wasteland of jagged ice and endless snow stretched as far as the eye could see, illuminated only by the dim glow of a dying red dwarf sun. This was no ordinary planet. It was a crucible of suffering, the ultimate test of survival, where even the strongest species had fallen. Inside the shuttle, Patrick Barnes sat among a group of alien competitors, his breath steady, his heartbeat slow. The Galactic Academy's survival trials were infamous, designed to push the brightest students of the galaxy to their absolute limits. The challenge was simple: survive 72 hours with nothing but the bare essentials. There would be no advanced technology, no communication, and no rescue unless they forfeited. To activate their emergency beacons was to admit failure. Patrick felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes on him. He was the only human aboard, a species seen as unremarkable in this grand interstellar stage. The Academy was a proving ground where species from across the cosmos competed for supremacy, and humans. They were newcomers. Weak, soft, fragile. At least, that's what the others believed. From the front of the cabin, Professor Zinth observed the students. The towering Drary, with emerald green scales and piercing yellow eyes, had overseen these trials for centuries. He had seen species break on this planet. He had watched them shatter, freeze, and beg for mercy. His species, the Drary, had long been the intellectual rulers of the galaxy, their cold, analytical minds shaping its most brutal tests. And yet this year, something was different. There was a human among the competitors. Zinth's eyes lingered on Patrick with barely concealed disdain. This will be over quickly, he thought. Humans are not built for this. He cleared his throat, his voice booming through the comms. You will have 72 hours, he announced. Your only task is survival. Your resources are limited. Your instincts will be your greatest ally and your worst enemy. Remember, activating your emergency beacon is an admission of failure. There is no shame in knowing your limits. He let the words sink in before flicking a clawed hand toward the airlock. Good luck. With a sharp hiss, the restraints on their seats unlocked. Before anyone could hesitate, the doors of the transport slid open, exposing them to the raw, merciless cold. A violent gust of sub-zero wind screamed through the cabin like a wraith, slicing through their thermal suits as if they were paper. The temperature outside, a mind-numbing minus 200 degrees Celsius. The shuttle's interior heat was ripped away instantly, replaced with a bone-deep chill that stole the breath from their lungs. One by one, the students leaped into the frozen abyss. Patrick took a final deep breath and jumped. The impact knocked the wind from his chest. His boots struck solid ice, harder than steel, and his breath came out in thick white plumes, disappearing into the howling wind. The air was razor-thin, barely breathable. Around him, his alien competitors struggled, each in their own way. To his left, Carthar, a massive arthropod encased in thick chitin, clicked his mandibles in distress. His kind came from a humid jungle world, where the temperature never dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. He tried to burrow into the ice, instinctively seeking warmth, but the surface was too solid, too unforgiving. Each attempt sent him sliding backward, his heavy carapace making movement almost impossible. Further ahead, Veras, a towering silicon-based entity, hunched over, his crystalline body audibly cracking. His species, the Terran, thrived in volcanic landscapes where molten rivers flowed like water. Here, on this frozen wasteland, he was dying. His normally brilliant, bioluminescent veins flickered, struggling to keep him intact. To Patrick's right, a group of Fanny, an amphibious species from an oceanic world, huddled together, pressing their slick, blue-tinted skin against one another. Their physiology allowed them to regulate temperature in warm waters, but exposed to air, they were rapidly losing moisture, their skin turning brittle and cracked within minutes. It was chaos. Every species was fighting their own biology, their own instincts. They were trying to resist the cold, fight against it. And that was their first mistake. Patrick didn't panic. He didn't fight the cold. He worked with it. Adapt. Think. Execute. While the others wasted energy struggling, Patrick reached into his survival pack, pulling out his thermal scanner. It beeped softly, showing a faint orange glow beneath the snow, a pocket of trapped heat, a natural insulation layer. It wasn't much, but it was something. He moved quickly, methodically, using his multi-tool to cut through the ice. He didn't just dig, he crafted. An igloo, a thermal capsule, a shelter. It was a technique perfected by Earth's Arctic survivalists, who had lived in these conditions for centuries. Within 10 minutes, he had constructed a compact, efficient snow cave, designed to trap body heat and block the relentless wind. The other aliens barely noticed. They were still reacting to the cold, shivering, huddling, or retreating. That was their second mistake. Patrick crawled inside, sealing the entrance behind him. The difference was immediate. The temperature stabilized. It was still cold, but no longer deadly. He reached into his supply pack, pulling out a small metal canister. He gave it a gentle shake. Water, a precious resource. He set it down, unsealing the compact heater plate from his emergency kit. Within minutes, steam curled into the frigid air as he boiled water and prepared a simple tea. It was warm. It was life. Outside, the howling wind screamed like a dying beast. Patrick sat back, taking slow, steady sips of the tea, letting the warmth spread through his chest. And then he heard it, a low, rhythmic clicking outside his shelter. Footsteps. He reached for his multi-tool, his muscles tensing instinctively. A shadow loomed just beyond the entrance. Patrick's breath slowed. Someone, or something, was out there. Fire, ice, and the desperate. Patrick's muscles tensed as the low, rhythmic clicking outside his shelter grew louder. His hand instinctively tightened around his multi-tool, its serrated edge gleaming faintly in the dim light. The wind outside continued its merciless howling, but the sound of footsteps crunching against ice was unmistakable. Who, or what, was out there? He exhaled slowly, controlling his breathing. Panic was the first enemy. Fear burned energy, and in this frozen wasteland, wasted energy meant death. His grip on the multi-tool relaxed slightly as he reassessed the situation. The rhythmic clicking was familiar. It was Carthar, the massive arthropod competitor from earlier, the one who had struggled to move through the ice. Patrick hesitated. Did he let him in? Humanity had a long history of competing civilizations, tribes fighting for resources, countries waging war over land. But Earth's greatest strength wasn't just warfare, it was cooperation. The ability to adapt not only to environments but to people. No species in the known galaxy had built itself on alliances, strategies, and collective survival quite like humanity had. Patrick moved toward the shelter's entrance, careful not to expose himself to the direct wind, and slowly unsealed the ice-packed doorway. The moment the barrier was broken, Carthar collapsed inside. His exoskeleton was covered in a thick layer of frost, his mandibles clicking weakly, his movements sluggish. The cold had already begun to cripple him. His species, adapted for humid jungles, had no defense against the freezing temperatures. Patrick acted immediately. He pulled Carthar deeper into the shelter and grabbed his emergency thermal blanket, pressing the thin metallic fabric against the alien's shivering form. The reflective material trapped body heat, slowing the rapid loss of warmth. Carthar's multifaceted eyes blinked sluggishly as his body convulsed. Freezing. Carthar's voice was weak, his usual deep clicking tones barely audible. His limbs twitched, struggling to move. Patrick gritted his teeth and adjusted his own suit's thermal regulator to maximum output. The system was inefficient, meant for temporary relief, not sustained warmth, But at this moment, it was the best source of heat transfer he had. Without hesitation, Patrick pressed his heated forearm against Carthar's frozen carapace, hoping to transfer enough warmth to keep him alive. Minutes passed. The wind outside screamed like a dying beast, its fury relentless. Inside the makeshift thermal capsule, it was silent, except for the labored breathing of two survivors. Slowly, Carthar's trembling subsided. His massive limbs moved slightly, his strength returning. Patrick leaned back, exhaling sharply. For now, they were safe. But outside, the others wouldn't last the night. The sound of desperation. Patrick sat against the compacted snow wall, his thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The small space was significantly warmer than the outside, but without a fire or proper insulation, it wouldn't last indefinitely. Carthar's breathing had stabilized, his internal body temperature slowly recovering. But Patrick knew that this was just the beginning. Then, through the howling wind, he heard it, a sound that sent a chill through his bones. A distant, deep cracking noise. Patrick's eyes snapped open. Ice was breaking. He pushed himself up, grabbing the thermal scanner and crawling toward the entrance. Carefully, he peeled back the ice-packed door just enough to peer into the blizzard outside. The world was a swirling abyss of white and gray, a landscape consumed by an endless storm. His goggles adjusted, enhancing contrast and scanning for heat signatures. Then he saw it. A cluster of figures in the distance. They were moving, barely. Some were crawling, others stumbling forward. Patrick recognized them immediately. The funny, the amphibious species from earlier, the ones that had huddled together in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They were dying. Their skin, designed for warm oceanic climates, was cracking, their bodies desiccating in the dry, cold air. Their movements were slow, weak, their limbs barely responding. One of them, a female, barely conscious, collapsed completely, her body motionless against the ice. Patrick's gut tightened. If he didn't move now, they wouldn't last another hour. He turned to Carthar, who was still sluggish but alive. "We need to help them," Patrick said, his voice firm. Carthar's mandibles twitched, his large compound eyes focusing on Patrick. "Dying," Carthar managed to click out, his voice weak but understanding. Patrick nodded. There was no winning this trial if you didn't make it through the first night, and there was no surviving alone. Earth had proven it. History had proven it. The greatest survivors weren't always the strongest, nor the fastest. They were the ones who helped each other. A fire in the frozen abyss. Patrick moved quickly. The shelter was small, barely enough for two, but he had an idea. He grabbed the thermal scanner again, searching for a second pocket of trapped heat under the ice. It wasn't much, but 10 meters away, the scanner detected a faint warm layer, likely from compacted snow insulating the air beneath. That's where he would build the second shelter. But first, he needed fire. Fire meant life. His survival kit contained a small chemical heat generator, designed for temporary warmth. It wouldn't last the entire trial, but it would be enough to keep the new shelter from freezing completely. Patrick grabbed his digging tool, his breath steady. He had built one shelter. He would build another. Because humans didn't just survive. They adapted. They built. They saved others. And when the aliens of this competition finally understood that, they would fear humanity for all the right reasons. The fire that defied the frozen abyss. The wind howled like a starving beast, ripping through the icy wasteland with merciless intent. The night had swallowed Frost9, plunging it into an endless frozen void where the weak perished and only the strongest, or the smartest, had a chance of seeing another dawn. Patrick knew that if he didn't act now, the Fanny would not survive the next hour. Inside the compact snow shelter, Carthar, the massive arthropod alien, had stopped shivering. His body had absorbed enough warmth to function again, but the frost had done its damage. His movements were sluggish, his limbs weak, and Patrick knew he couldn't count on him for much help. That meant it was all on him. Patrick pressed his goggles against his face and pulled his hood tighter. His thermal scanner still showed the pocket of trapped heat beneath the ice about 10 meters away. That would be the key to survival, for both him and the Fanny. If he could dig into that insulated layer and build a second shelter, he could save them. He had to save them. Because unlike the aliens who saw this as a test of their individual resilience, Patrick understood a truth that had propelled humanity forward for thousands of years. Survival wasn't about strength. It wasn't about endurance. It was about cooperation. And fire. Because fire was life. The race against time. Patrick moved fast. He grabbed the small chemical heat generator from his survival kit, the last real source of warmth he had left. It was supposed to be used sparingly, but there was no point saving it if they were all dead by morning. He turned to Carthar. "Stay here. Keep warm. I'll be back." The alien's mandibles twitched weakly. He still couldn't speak much, but Patrick could see in his multifaceted eyes that he understood. Patrick didn't waste another second. He pushed through the shelter's ice-packed entrance, the momentary exposure to the raging blizzard sending a razor-sharp chill through his body. The temperature had dropped even further. It had to be below -220 degrees Celsius now. Even his insulated suit struggled against the cold. He kept moving. His boots crunched against the compact ice, his breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. Every step was a test of willpower, every second an act of defiance against an environment that wanted him dead. And then, he saw them. The Fanny were barely alive. Their once smooth, water-rich skin was cracking, turning brittle in the dry, frozen air. Their limbs trembled as they huddled together, their bodies locked in an instinctual attempt to preserve what little moisture remained. One of them, a female, smaller than the others, was lying motionless in the snow. Her breathing was shallow, unsteady. Patrick didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, ignoring the instant shock of cold that passed through his gloves as he lifted her fragile body. She was light as a feather, but freezing solid. The others, 3 in total, looked at him with dull, barely conscious eyes. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They had never seen a species like his, one that would risk their own survival for another. Patrick gestured toward them urgently. "Move. Come with me. Shelter, warmth, fire." They hesitated. They didn't trust him. Not yet. Patrick knew he didn't have time to explain. Instead, he acted. He activated the heat generator, pressing it against the chest of the weakest Fanny, the female in his arms. The moment the warmth seeped into her skin, her body reacted. Her eyes fluttered open, her breathing stabilized, just a little. It was enough. The other Fanny saw this. They saw the miracle of heat, the promise of survival. And then, without another word, they moved. They followed him, building a fire in the heart of ice. By the time Patrick reached the marked heat pocket, his legs felt like lead. Every muscle burned. His lungs screamed for warmth. But he didn't stop. He dropped to his knees, grabbing his multi-tool. And he dug. The compact ice was thick, unyielding, but Patrick worked fast, precisely, cutting into it with methodical efficiency. The knowledge of Earth's Arctic survivalists ran through his mind. How to build a shelter that could trap heat, how to use the environment instead of fighting against it. Minutes passed. The wind howled. The Fanny shivered, barely hanging on. But then, the ice gave way. A small hollow chamber opened beneath the compacted layers, a natural insulation pocket. Not much, but enough. Patrick widened the opening, pulling the Fanny inside. It wasn't warm, but it was warmer than outside. That meant survival. But they still needed fire. Patrick pulled out his last emergency thermal blanket, lining the walls of the small shelter, reflecting as much body heat inward as possible. And then he grabbed the heat generator. The small device hummed, its chemical core reacting to the extreme cold, generating a faint but steady warmth. It wasn't much, but it was fire. Patrick pressed it to the center of the group, ensuring that all of them, himself included, could absorb the heat. The Fanny huddled closer, their bodies responding to the rising temperature. Their skin stopped cracking, their breathing steadied. Patrick sat back, his body aching, his mind buzzing with exhaustion. But he had done it. He had saved them. And as the storm raged on outside, he realized something. The others, the other competitors, the ones who had gone off alone, they wouldn't last. Not without shelter. Not without fire. Not without help. Patrick stared at the dim glow of the heat generator, feeling the weight of his own exhaustion pressing down on him. He had built 2 shelters, but he knew what had to come next. If he wanted to make it through the next 72 hours, he would have to find the others. Because this was no longer a competition. This was war against the elements. And humanity didn't lose wars.